Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. We're talking about Reconstruction today. The idea here is how are we going to rebuild the South, or how are we going to rebuild our nation after the Civil War is over? So, if you want to write this down for your notes, Reconstruction is the era after the Civil War when the South went through the process of being accepted back into the Union. So this isn't just about how do we rebuild cities and how do we rebuild plantations. It's about how we rebuild our nation. So Lincoln, we talked about this in our Civil War unit in the recap. Lincoln's idea was to get people back into the Union as quickly and as easily as possible. His plan was to make it as easy as possible to the South, or as easy as possible for the South to re-enter the Union with a few rules that they had to follow. So I would suggest you write these down in your notes. This will be helpful for you later. Lincoln's plan is the quick and easy 10% plan. So basically, he says, y'all are welcome back in as long as you do these few things. Number one, we're going to make sure that all of the Confederate soldiers, all of the generals, the high ranking officers, there is no real punishment for them. In fact, they have a complete government pardon from everything. Now, some of the high ranking officials, they did not allow them to run for Congress seats or uh, high offices like governor of a state. They weren't allowed to do those sort of things, but there was no real punishment for these people. So the South kind of gets away without any real tough punishment. The second part is 10% of voters within the South have to take an oath of allegiance, just 10%. This is just a way for the North to hold the South responsible for their actions and make sure that they don't go back on their promise to not secede again. So basically, this is asking the South to promise to not do this kind of thing again. And then the last part, which is probably the most important part, is when the states re enter the Union, the 13th Amendment must be adopted. They have to abolish slavery in these states. And really and truly, this plan that Lincoln has, he wants it to be like there was no uh, Confederacy. The South never actually left. He never officially recognized them as a country, and he wanted to make sure that they were welcomed back and treated them as though they had never really left in the first place. Okay. Now, President Andrew Johnson, and it was just a few days after the war was officially over that Lincoln was shot and killed. And whenever he was shot and killed, Andrew Johnson became the president. And he was pretty lenient on the South as well, but for different reasons than Lincoln had. His plan, which we'll go over in just a minute, was a little bit more difficult than what Abraham Lincoln had planned out for the South, but not nearly as bad as what the radical Republicans wanted the South to have to go through. So we're going to go through both of those plans as well. So I'd definitely take notes on these. So first off, Andrew Johnson's plan. Uh, Basically the same thing as what Lincoln wanted, except for he wanted each state to withdraw their secession. Basically, when they seceded from the Union, they wrote a letter to the United States saying that they are going to leave and join this Confederacy. And he basically is looking for an apology for this or a letter in response to this, withdrawing this action and basically asking to be re entered. Also, each of these states must swear allegiance to the United States. This could look different for each one, but they basically had to rewrite their state constitutions to line up with the United States Constitution. The next point says annul war debts. Basically, what this means is the South is going to be responsible for any cost that it takes to rebuild the South. The North is not going to be responsible for paying for the damage that was caused because of the war. This is definitely going to cost the South a lot of money to rebuild, and Andrew Johnson is basically telling them that's their problem and not his. And then also they must adopt the 13th Amendment. Um, Now, Andrew Johnson and his view on the 13th Amendment is a little bit different, or not the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. Andrew Johnson's view on the 14th Amendment, he was not in favor of it. And tomorrow we'll go into a little more depth and detail as far as what the 14th Amendment says. But basically, the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to the African Americans who were slaves before the war was over. Um, Johnson felt that the 13th Amendment was sufficient. There did not need to be any further explanation or any further protection for these people. He felt that relieving them of slavery was enough. Now, let's move on to the Radical Republicans' plan. Now, radical, that word radical means really out there. It's really extreme, is what it means. And the extreme Republicans, and remember, Lincoln was Republican, but I would not classify him as a radical Republican. The radical Republicans, they wanted punishment for the South. Um, they wanted the government to be in charge of taking care of this reunion or this reuniting of the South to the North. And they wanted punishment in several different ways. So the first one was they wanted an ironclad oath. They wanted 100% of the citizens in the South to basically swear allegiance to the United States. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how they would accomplish that, but that's what they wanted. The next part is they wanted military occupation in the South, which did take place for a little while. And basically what this means is there's going to be the military, the United States military will be kind of watching the Southerners to make sure that they aren't going to be continuing this act of slavery. And they're going to make sure they're going to go from farm to farm, plantation to plantation, to make sure that slaves are not being held uh, against their will. Um, and then they wanted to pass the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment, like I said, tomorrow we'll talk more in depth about what it is. But the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment made the slaves, or the former slaves, citizens. And when Johnson rejected this plan, they were trying to find a way to have him impeached. And they do end up impeaching him for something that they had rule they had put into place to kind of catch him in the act of doing something illegal. So, in order to try to control President Johnson, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act. And basically, what this did is they wanted to have control over everything he did, including hiring and firing of people in his cabinet. Now, if we talk about the cabinet in the past, we know that that's an exclusive right to the president, to where he can choose the people that he wants, whether they're good or bad or whatever, qualified or not. He's allowed to choose whoever he wants. And if we think about this, the cabinet that Johnson receives is actually Abraham Lincoln's cabinet. When Lincoln was reelected for his second term, he gave his second inaugural speech in March of 1865. And then just a month later in April, just days after the war was over, Lincoln was assassinated. Well, at this point, Lincoln already had his cabinet filled, and he already had the people in place that he wanted in place. These were not the same people that Johnson wanted. And the way that Congress was trying to control Johnson was by making sure that everything he did, he had to seek their approval. So what Johnson did is he went ahead and fired this guy. He fired the Secretary of War, and the Congress impeached him for this. So he did do something illegal. Now, we've seen the impeachment process. We've talked about this in class. We know that this happened recently in 2019, in 2020. In this process, just because you're impeached does not mean that you are removed from office. First, they're going to decide, one, are you guilty of breaking the law? And then two, are we going to remove you? They did decide that Johnson was guilty of breaking the law because he did break the law. It's very obvious. But when they voted to remove him, they decided we don't need to remove him. But he won this by only one vote. So if one person had swayed their vote the other way, he would have been removed from office. And at this point, this was around 1867. He didn't have much time left in office. There was an election coming up, and Ulysses S. Grant, when he ran for president, it was a pretty surefire thing that he was going to win the office of the presidency, and he did. So the Congress did not have to deal with Johnson for long, but they did have a whole new set of problems when Grant took the office, and we will talk more about that tomorrow. So hopefully you've got these notes written down. Hopefully you are doing well with this, and um, these notes, I don't intend for them to be very long, but it's important that you take these notes down and you write them down for your quizzes. So make sure you're doing that. All right, I'm going to let y'all go. I hope y'all have a great day. Don't forget to wash your hands. Bye-bye.